Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are finally here. It is best of 5 time at the First Stand International Tournament. It is finally time for the semi-finals. Our first team was, of course, eliminated in the group stage yesterday on day number 5. That, of course, being Team Liquid representing the LTA. It's unfortunate that they will not get to the best of 5 stage, but we are finally here, finally in that best of 5 stage. That's really going to make or break a lot of these teams' perceptions of this international tournament, whether or not it was considered a success or a failure. You still have to win here today. No double elimination. It is do or die for all 4 teams that are going to be competing across our 2 best of 5s here today, and they are very intriguing matchups. If you want to know my thoughts on how this tournament has gone up until this point, check out the playlist up in the iCard. That's going to have every single day covered in the way that we are going to do today's video, except obviously it's 2 best of 3s per day instead of 2 best of 5s. We've covered days 1 through 5, all of the group stages. My primer with my expectations was up there as well. Obviously, you can check in and see how that has translated, how those guesses have gone. It's not gone entirely horribly, but obviously my predictions and just expectations were in line with a lot of other people's, and things have just not gone according to plan so far at this tournament for a lot of these teams, and we'll talk about that as we continue to go along. But I'm super excited to finally be getting into the best of 5 stage, to be getting into these like real nitty-gritty series. I hope you are as well. If you are, let me know down in the comment section below. What did you expect from these series? Did they live up to your expectations, or were you surprised by the outcomes? Always curious to hear your thoughts and opinions, but without further ado, let's get into the content itself, shall we? If you are new to the channel, what we're going to do is go game by game in both of these best of 5s, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover, and at the end of each series, I will be giving a player of the series to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. By the end of this video, we are going to know our final 2 teams, our First Stand finals, and we're going to be previewing it. We're going to be talking about what we can expect from those 2 teams, who I think is favored to come out on top, and whether or not I think it will be an interesting series that we will cover tomorrow. But of course, most of today will be spent talking about the semifinals themselves. So let's get into our first series, and quite frankly, the first series here is more interesting to me on paper, which I don't think a lot of people are going to say. I think the second series of the day definitely feels like more of a mismatch, especially in terms of current form, but the 2-3 matchup is very intriguing here for a variety of different reasons. It's of course a matchup between the number 2 seeded CTBC Flying Oyster and the number 3 seeded Karmine Corp. This is very, very interesting because I think both of these teams are kind of defying expectations in a couple of different ways. Of course, CFO on the upper side of this matchup with side control for this matchup, them going 3-1 in the group stage was super unexpected. Me and I believe basically everybody else going into this tournament expected them to be the worst team here, to be the first team eliminated, to not make this best of stage. Not only did they make the top 4, make the best of stage, they were locked in by the end of day number 4. They did not even need day number 5 in order to confirm that, and they were clearly the second best team in the group stage. The only team that they ended up dropping a series to was Hanwha Esports. They took care of North America, they took care of Europe, and most importantly, they took care of the LPL in a 2-0 win. These were all things that we just didn't see as possible for CFO going into the tournament, but they've been super impressive. A lot of their, playstyle tendencies that they used very effectively domestically, they have translated well to this tournament. A lot of the things like playing around bot lane early game and playing through your mid lane or late game and, trying to play for front-to-back team fights, those things have been effective at this tournament, but now they have to be able to keep their foot on the gas, despite the fact that they are coming in as the number 2 seed, that they are coming in with a significantly better record than their opponent. It's not even guaranteed that they're favorites going into this series because they're running into Karmine Corp, K-Corp, who is kind of getting a lot hotter right now than they were at the start of this tournament. I've talked about it a lot on this channel. One of the big reasons why I was willing to give K-Corp a lot of leniency, I guess I'll say, at the beginning of this tournament was because they got here so much later than every other team. The LEC was the last region to actually end up finishing. Them and the LPL were kind of neck and neck in terms of getting to this tournament a lot later than everybody else, and I think that that was really impacting K-Corp's ability to play at the beginning part of this tournament. The version of them that we saw in the first couple of games, specifically the middle of the map, Yike and Vladi, for this team is entirely different to what we have seen over the last couple of days. They didn't play on day number 5, but days 1 and 2 are very very different than what we've seen out of them on days 3 and 4, where they pull off the upset and are able to take down top Esports, which, looks less and less like an upset the more we go into this tournament. And then, of course, also taking a game off of Hanwha Life, which felt basically impossible for a lot of teams throughout this tournament. K-Corp has been able to do that, and they have been able to level up. And a big reason for that, at least in my mind, is them just getting accustomed and getting their brains ready to play in Korea, getting used to the time zone, getting used to being in the country, like getting time to settle in and like actually, sit down and get used to playing the games at this arena. Like all of the mundane, like structure things that you need in order to feel comfortable playing at a tournament like this, they had much less time to acclimate to that than every other team. And I think that's why we're seeing them level up a lot more as we go throughout the tournament. Now, there still are pretty clear flaws here, and I think if you wanted to consider them underdogs in this series, you absolutely still can. Kana has been spectacular on the top side, but the mid-jungle duo has still been pretty inconsistent. Yike has definitely been better, but he was the worst player in the entire tournament through the first couple of days. He was unplayable on days 1 and 2 if you're getting that version of Yike, especially going into a player like Junjia, who has arguably been the best performing jungler at this tournament so far. Like, that could be a bit of an issue for K-Corp to overcome, and I think most concerningly to me, Vladi is definitely still in the running for being the worst performing player at this tournament. To me, it's between him and Impact, who was the worst player at first stand in the group stage. Vladi, even in their wins, even when they were starting to turn things around at the end of the group stage, those wins that ended up getting them into this spot in the first place, like Vladi was still a bit of an anchor for this team in the mid lane. He's going to need to be the domestic version of himself if this team really wants any chance of being able to compete with CFO at this level. Kaliste and Targamas have been good, maybe not like exceptionally good. I would definitely say that Doggo and Kaiwing have been more impressive on the other side of this matchup, but again, K-Corp has the talent. When you look at this roster from top to bottom, you're kind of expecting them to be better, or you certainly would have expected them to be better going into this tournament. If you can get the domestic performances out of players like Vladi and Yike and Targamas, like that is something that CFO can't really match. As much as I like the players on the other side of this matchup for them, a lot of the series is going to be up to whether or not K-Corp shows up, and I think for me, I'm kind of predicting that they can, but if CFO is able to control the tempo of the game, which is something they've done really well so far throughout this tournament, and play their own style, which is playing through the bot lane 2v2, getting them a lead, allowing them to skirmish in like 3v3s around Dragon early on in the game, and then using Hongq in particular as somebody who can really take over in the team fighting stage, that is a really effective formula that they've been able to use to win a lot of games. Hongq has been awesome in terms of what he's been able to do, surviving laning phase even in bad matchups. Doggo and Kaiwing have been one of the best 2v2 lanes that we've seen here, and Junji has had some awesome early games so far throughout this tournament. There is a lot to like about CFO, adding on to the fact that this is now a best of 5, and one of the big reasons why we talked about this team as being interesting is because they have a 6-man roster. They have 2 top laners that they basically 50-50 swap out of, Rest and Driver, and where that really comes into a big advantage for them is, of course, in these best of 5s, where, in Fearless, you start to lose more and more champions. Well, if you have 2 different players with 2 different champion pools, now you can have Rest play the first couple of games and then swap him out, and Driver's champions are not taken yet. They're not off the board for Fearless, which definitely makes things a lot more interesting for CFO. So there are definitely reasons to still favor them. Most of all, obviously, the fact that they've just looked better at this tournament and that they already beat K-Corp at this tournament. That's definitely the big one, but, I called my shot in yesterday's video. I said I think K-Corp are favorites to this. I think that they will win. I think I said K-Corp 3-2 in yesterday's video. Someone can fact check me on that in the last 2 minutes of that video, but that's kind of what I'm expecting. A close series between these two teams that I think are going to be relatively evenly matched, because I think CFO is good. I just think K-Corp has been getting better throughout the tournament, and I would expect them to be able to come out on top, but the only way to know if I'm correct in that assertion is to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was K-Corp. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up in this series 1-0, and this is kind of exactly what you're looking for at the start of this series from them. They don't have side selection, so being able to win game number 1 all of a sudden completely reverses the momentum of this series, because now you do have side selection for, preferably the rest of the series. Even if things just flip back and forth, you're going to be able to be on the side that you want in games 4 or 5, like when it becomes the most important. So this is a pretty big win. Being able to establish that you only have to win 50% of the rest of the games in this series is obviously good, but just the fact that they can show that they can play a really clean game against a team like CFO that has a really good game plan in a draft where CFO kind of gets a lot of the big power picks of the meta right now that have been outplaying their expected results. Champions like Rumble, champions like Azir that have been performing really well so far at first stand. The fact that K-Corp can give all of those over and still perform really well, I think is very encouraging Obviously, we can talk about draft. I think that's always where we like to start here. I think these are very similar drafts, just with different ideas in terms of when they want to spike. K-Corp's draft really wants to control a lot of the tempo, and I think they should. I'm really not a fan of the Azir pick on B3, and I know I kind of harp on Azir a lot, but I do think this is another situation where Azir is just not in that great of a spot. And specifically, it's because not only do you have Rumble on the top side, but you have Xin Zhao, and they've picked Sejuani. And so you're picking up the Azir, you know Yone is coming. They've picked Sej, the Rumble is already here. If you pick Azir, Yone is great into Azir. Yone does a really good job of shutting down Rumble because he can blow him up early in the game or in team fights. And, Sejuani and Yone are the combo in the mid lane, not to mention the fact that Vladi has played a ton of Yone, not only here at this tournament, but domestically. Yone is coming on R3. You can basically be 100% sure of that with how this draft ended up going. And Hongq still opted into the Azir, which again, I just do not think is a good Azir matchup. And he's been doing this throughout the entire tournament. A lot of players have been doing this, but mostly Hongq has been doing this throughout the entire tournament, and he's not really been punished because he is just kind of surviving in the early laning phase. This was the first time where it was you opted into a pretty horrible matchup and you got exploited because you were greedy. And to me, this is what should have been happening the entire time for CFO is, a team actually taking advantage of draft mistakes that they are making and draft greed, quite frankly, that they are making, and K-Corp absolutely did that. Outside of that, though, the Yone is going to have a ton of pressure early on in the mid lane. Jace obviously is naturally going to have more pressure than Rumble in the early game, or at least you would imagine. That's not always how it's gone internationally so far, when you talk about the LPL and the LCK, but it certainly should happen. Kana certainly should have more priority than someone like Rest at the beginning part of this game, and that gives Yike a lot more priority than maybe you would expect playing Sejuani into the Xin Zhao. That's not necessarily a matchup where you would expect Sej to be able to control the early game, and, Xin should be able to, stabilize a lot of the early game and get Azir, Sivir, Rumble into the later half, but the problem is, again, that you just don't have any winning lanes, and so it's much harder for Xin to actually be able to, pressure out a Sejuani in those instances because she still can skirmish, and that's what happened. The only thing that I like from CFO is I continue to like the Sivir into these, less wave cleary types of AD carries. The Ezreal we've seen earlier on in this tournament, now the Varus, these more all-encompassing type of AD carries. Sivir can just shove them in, and they can't really express a lot of their mid-game power because they don't really have any opportunity to ever fight. Sivir can really neutralize the game pretty easily from that phase, but really, both of these teams kind of want to fight front to back, especially the later this game ends up going. So much engage on both of their ends. The Alistair obviously kind of leading the way for CFO, but look at this comp. It's Azir, Rumble, Sivir. Of course they want to try and play front to back later on in the game, and they scale incredibly well if they can get there. But for K-Corp, you also have a ridiculous amount of engage here. Leona plus Sejuani is already a ton, but add Yone ult on top of that, add Varus ult on top of that. You have plenty of different ways to start fights, and if you do have a gold lead, which is super likely in this game, then you can actually front to back in a way that's going to be more consistent than maybe people would give you credit for, and they kind of ended up executing on that. They just kind of were the better team in the early game, as was anticipated with this draft, and they never really let go of the reins. They end up closing out the game pretty cleanly. Player of the game is going to go to Kana in the top lane. Didn't have to think about this at all. Kana has been easily the best player on K-Corp at this entire tournament. I think that there's an argument that he's been a top 2, maybe, I'm not going to say top 1, right? Because Zeus has been unreal, but a top 2 top laner at this tournament. I think that that's entirely fair to say. The rest of his team has completely been inting him the entirety of this tournament, specifically his jungle and mid lane, and he continues to just play at a really high level. The Jace has looked very good for him domestically, and that's carried over here internationally. I'm just proud of Kana. He has definitely stepped up at this tournament and been the best player on K-Corp, and that continued here going into the Rumble. Again, this is a matchup we've not always seen Jace win, so it's nice to see him win it when he should, because he absolutely should in this game. Big credit to Yike. I think he played the Sejuani really well in this one, just creating a lot of opportunities for the rest of the team, utilizing the pressure that he gets from the lanes to actually push forward and really, kind of frustrate Junjia, take him out of his comfort zone in terms of being able to play around that mid game. Vladi and Kaliste were good as well. Targamas was solid on the Leona. Really no major negatives to give K-Corp. They just did a really good job of understanding where their comp ends up thriving and how they can get the most out of that. And I think they did a great job in that respect. And then for CFO on the other side, just not a really good game number one. Again, I think your draft already puts you in a little bit of a rough position because you're just kind of hoping and praying that K-Corp don't take too much of an advantage of that early game pressure that they're going to have. The Xin Zhao has to focus bot lane. There's actually no other way for this team to be able to play the game. Now, that's kind of what you probably wanted to do anyways, is focus on Doggo and Kaiwing, and so I can't be super frustrated. I think in a lot of circumstances, I would not like the Xin Zhao in this draft because I think it's kind of asynergistic from the rest of this team, but because you can play for bot lane 2v2 into and Prio down there and, try to take the Varus and the Leona out of their comfort zone. I think that's where Xin can potentially like stabilize the game and make the mid game a little bit more interesting so you can get your solo laners into the spot where they can carry later on. But the problem is like Xin is not going to be able to play for the top side of the map even a little bit. And quite frankly, Junjia just wasn't interested in playing for the bottom side of the map nearly as much as he should have been. Junjia is going to get dud of the game. He completely gave up on even attempting to contest objectives throughout a majority of the back half of this game, specifically the Dragons, where he gave over not only Soul but Elder basically for free throughout the back half of this game. It just wasn't a very good look. The problem for Junjia is he's not a very good player at playing from behind, even though he's a really good team fighter. He loves neutral game states, and when he can get there, it's obviously really positive, but when Yike has so much control, and especially when the draft itself doesn't really give you a ton of options, as a Xin Zhao in this game, it's really difficult to end up playing it out. But part of that is Hongq like opting into this Azir matchup once again. This has been super common for CFO. This is not like a one-time thing. He's been doing this the entire tournament. He's just not been punished. This is the first time where it's felt like, yeah, you picked Azir into one of the worst possible positions to pick Azir, the most obvious Yone pick in the entire world. No early game pressure, no ability to stabilize, and you got clobbered on it. Like, this is what should have been happening. Absolutely. Hongq finally getting punished for picking the champion that he is clearly most comfortable on in a spot that's actually horrible for it. He had a really bad game. Rest was absolutely nothing on the Rumble. That is maybe the strongest champion in the game right now, at least in my opinion, certainly up there with Kalista for that mark, and Rest did not look relevant. Doggo and Kaiwing were fine, but again, they had the good lane, and so how much can you even really put that on them? Overall, for CFO, you're frustrated that you dropped game number 1, but if you get a better draft coming out here in game number 2, if you have a little bit more priority in the early game, which you've done really well with, I think that's going to be fine for them. But if K-Corp can get that 2-0 lead, it's pretty tough to win 3 games in a row against anybody that's going to be making an international tournament, let alone a K-Corp team that has gotten better over the course of it. So, big game number 2 here. Who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 2 was K-Corp. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to go up in this series 2-0, and things are not looking good for CFO. If we thought game number 1 was bad, and if we thought they were making some draft faux pas in game number 1, they're making even worse ones in game number 2 here. This was a demolition. I'm serious. This was like the most disgusting game I've seen in a very long time. K-Corp absolutely obliterated them, and honestly, they're once again doing it just through early game control, through drafting a comp that just wants to play fast and aggressive, who has a bunch of winning lanes, who wants to play, around these mid-game skirmishes, and CFO not really having a lot to be able to answer that. This is a comp that ramps up over time. You're trying to play around the Kindred, you're trying to play around the Ezreal, but how are you ever supposed to get there with this draft? We'll talk about that, I guess, right now, as we start with draft as per usual. K-Corp once again has all of the pressure and priority in the world, and I think a lot of it comes through the middle of the map, which really brings me to like the crux of what I'm going to complain about for CFO. It's very clear that they just were going to play Kindred Galio this game, that they weren't going to think about it really at all, that was always going to be the plan going into this, because if there is ever a comp to dissuade Kindred Galio, it should be the one that K-Corp drafted, the R1 Talia, the R4 Aatrox. I mean, obviously, you didn't know Pantheon was going to be the R5, but Pantheon was up, and, Yike has played this champion before. There are other aggressive junglers that are up that could be there to kind of deal with the Kindred in the early game, but I just don't know how you can ever justify picking Galio on B5 once Talia is on the other side. Like, there's genuinely nothing Galio can do here. Talia's going to be more active around the map. The global from Galio is basically completely neutralized by the fact that Talia's in the game, and the team fighting's not as good. Like, generally speaking, Galio doesn't have as much combat power as Talia does early, so I just don't really understand why you would ever go with Galio in this instance. He gets absolutely blown up by the Pantheon throughout a majority of this game. It's once again Hongq just opting into a bad matchup for basically no reason other than to hope and pray that it ends up working out. I just don't think that Hongq is a very smart drafter. I don't know if it's him or if it's their coach, but every other position on the team seems to have some semblance of like cohesion in terms of what pick ends up coming out, but Hongq has constantly put himself into bad matchup after bad matchup throughout this entire tournament. He's been able to get out of it because he's a good player and he's a very smart team fighter, but not against a team like K-Corp when they're actually trying to win. Like, it's not going to work out in the same kind of way, and we continuously see that. But even outside of that, CFO obviously want to play around the Kindred win condition in the late game. That's why you draft the champion. You want Junjia to be able to pop off in these team fights with support from things like Galio and Nautilus to be able to try and make that easier. The problem is, once again, CFO are opting completely out of any sort of early game priority. You don't have it in the mid lane, as I've already gone over. Kai'Sa has always been a champion that's done really well into Ezreal in lane, and so you're not really looking at a lane that you can feel great about. Perhaps Gragas into Aatrox, but even then, it's kind of more of a neutral lane than anything else, especially with the junglers probably not being particularly involved. solved on the top side of the map. I say that, but obviously, you know, things don't end up working out like that with Driver, who ends up running it down in this game. But I guess my point is that K-Corp will control the pacing of this game. They should be able to win every single skirmish in the mid game over any objective that they're actually looking for. And if you get the Kai'Sa fed in this game, if you get the Aatrox fed in this game, then the fact that they have a Kindred, or you have a Kindred on the other side of this matchup, if you're CFO, it just doesn't matter. You're not really going to have enough damage to ever be able to break through. I just don't think this is a particularly good draft from CFO, and I think K-Corp took advantage of it. Player of the game can go to quite a few players. I'm giving it to Yike on the Pantheon because he was just so aggressive, so active in this game. You know, there's been some criticism that Yike's not been particularly good on carry junglers, and I think part of that is just true. Like, the Vi definitely stands out. It's a champion he's basically run it down on every single time he's played it at this tournament, but, you know, things like Pantheon can still work for K-Corp, I think, in the right circumstance, and especially with the draft that they had around him and the draft that they're going into for CFO, playing something that can be so aggressive in terms of fighting a lot in the mid game. Like, that's what you needed to draft here, and Yike, I think, executed on that the best of anybody in the game, but I do think that there were other options. Kaliste obviously got super fed here on the Kai'Sa. I think Targamas's engages on the Rel were really excellent. Vladi had a great game on the Taliyah, taking advantage of a really good matchup for him on that champion. Kana was fine on the top side, didn't really have to do all that much in comparison to everybody else because his laner was kind of killing himself without Kana's intervention, but this was just a really dominant game from K-Corp from top to bottom. Every single player on this team was just straight up better than their counterpart on the other side, and now they're sitting at 2-0 in this series. They are one game away from moving on to the finals, from going to the finals of First Stand after being the team that was most likely going to get knocked out of this tournament, even heading into the final day of groups. It's actually ridiculous how things have gone for them, how, I don't want to say lucky they've been, but just how much this team has leveled up and how much the circumstances around them at this tournament have really kind of conspired to give them the best possible shot to succeed. It's really cool to see. And then for CFO on the other side, like, you're just throwing away all of the goodwill that you've earned with the community in this series, where you're just like not drafting well and not playing well. All of the good vibes that this team had after going 3-1 in the group stage, taking down every team that wasn't Hanwha Life at this tournament, like, it feels like it's all disintegrating in front of our eyes because they just can't seem to find any sort of cohesion in their draft, and they can't seem to execute it all either. The solo laners have been awful, like truly unplayable so far. We've already talked enough about Hongq. I think this guy has actually just been horrible so far. Like, Jinjia has been horrible, but Driver, I mean, come on, dude. Dud of the game. It's not even close. Like, genuinely one of the worst Gragas games that you could possibly play. Actively inting. I saw some people online calling this a drunk driving PSA, with Gragas, you know, being, you know, a drinker and Driver being his name. It's a funny little joke, but like, oh my god, this was ridiculous. Like, he completely ran it down, and quite frankly, Driver has not been good at this tournament. Rest has been good at this tournament. Driver has not, and I think that's something that might continue onwards. We'll see what happens throughout the rest of the series if they continue to swap these two out, but Driver has definitely looked like the worst of these two in the top lane, and, you know, we already said it. Junjia got set super far behind because there was nothing he could do in the early game. Hongq can't actually play this game out. The Galio was actually useless as a mid laner in this one. And then Doggo and Kaiwing, once again, can't really do anything because even though they're the one lane that ends up being kind of useful throughout this game, they're in a bad matchup this time around, so they can't even have a gold lead because the Kai'Sa is just going to be much more active. And then also, the rest of their team is running it, so their gold lead that they don't already have is going to be useless anyways. He's on Ezreal. He can't salvage this game. And so for CFO, I once again just implore you to draft something that can actually have some sort of priority in the mid game because you are throwing away this series by not really having any way to fight K-Corp. But for K-Corp, you're one game away from sweeping the series and going to the finals. Can you get it done here in game number 3, or is CFO going to at least win one game and keep this series alive for at least one more? Well, the winner of game number 3 was CFO. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to stay alive here by, you know, turning the series into a 1-2, and thank God for that. I was worried that we were going to see CFO, after such a good group stage, get swept in their only best of 5 at this tournament. That would have felt like a pretty disappointing outcome, I think, for a team that generally has been awesome at this tournament, has been about as good as you could possibly ask them to be. Like, they're the number 2 seed for a reason. They're only behind Hanwha Life in terms of how they performed, and so to at least be able to pick up a win here, I think, is obviously good. This could potentially start a comeback for them. You never really know, but it's still kind of looking against them. The stats are definitely still looking against them. Having to win both of the final 2 games is just a really difficult ask, especially after you dropped the games in games 1 and 2, like, so decisively, I guess is maybe the word I'm looking for. This is a really good game number 3, but it's just kind of the start of what you have to do moving forward. Very curiously, K-Corp obviously won both games 1 and 2 on red side. CFO opting into red side here for game 3, and now they pick it up. Red side has not been considered to be the stronger side throughout this year. In fact, it was kind of a really big deal in the LCK when teams got blue side. That really determined who ended up winning the series in a lot of cases, and so for these teams to be not only opting into red side, but actively winning on red side, it's super curious in that front. But CFO had a much better plan here. I think they definitely took some of their losses to heart in terms of where they went with their draft. Instead of just drafting fully for scaling, they actually flip the script and they go entirely for early game here. They have no way to really fight consistently without a lead, even in the mid-game skirmishes, and they definitely don't scale particularly well. But if they can get that early lead, it is going to end up working out, and luckily for them, it does end up working out. Once again, I think K-Corp's draft is super cohesive. I think they have a very good idea of what they want to do throughout these games. The issue for them is they drafted a couple of champions that, while good, do not fit the players on this team. Please, God, stop giving Yike Vi. He cannot play this champion. It is actually absurd, and we will get to that as we go further. But once again, CFO are going to need to run the early game here, specifically like the early game, not the mid game. They don't even really have a lot of tools to be able to skirmish over objectives in the mid game. They really need to just win in laning phase, and specifically Rest and Hongq need to be in a really good spot in laning phase in order to try and make that transition a little bit easier for CFO going into the mid game. Junjia has to be on his best game. Like, there's nothing else to say, and he was in this one. Nidalee has actually proven to be a super successful champion, not only here at first stand, but throughout basically the entire year up until this point in all of the domestic leagues. I know it feels weird where Nidalee kind of feels like a feast or famine pick, but because her numbers are so good right now and because she can control the early game so effortlessly, it's actually really easy for her to be able to win games even when you're not like the more dominant jungler traditionally, and Junjia very much showed that off here. I think obviously playing towards Renekton on the top side is always going to be a positive, but having something like Tristana that you can play aggressive around in the mid lane, also really good. Junjia and Hongq both had a really nice game overall, and I think they paired up really well and created a lot of chances for the team. And so Junjia is going to get my player of the game because of that. Obviously, I don't think anybody's really going to dispute that all that much. Maybe you could consider giving this to Hongq, but generally the Nidalee, Renekton, Tristana, that's kind of the core of the team. That's what you were creating a lot of the rest of the team around, and so that's definitely what you have to kind of point out as player of the game worthy. Again, whether you want to give it to jungler or mid, I think is up to you, because Hongq did play really well. He capitalized well on all of the things that the rest of the team ended up creating. I was a little bit disappointed with his aggressiveness in this game. I do think he could have gone a bit deeper in a couple of instances, but I do understand why with all the lockdown and all the damage on the other side of this. Maybe he was a bit scared to get caught out and put himself into a bad position. It didn't really matter. Like, Junjia and Hongq were in good spots. The only thing I'll criticize here for the Oysters is Thresh on R5. I think Thresh is pretty unplayable as a champion right now. I get that Kaiwing is a bit of a boomer, a bit of an old head in terms of how long he's been playing in pro, and I'm sure he has a ridiculous amount of games on Thresh. I'm sure he feels very comfortable on that champion, especially in an elimination game. Going to Comfort, I think, always makes sense, but Thresh is just kind of a horrible champ at the current moment, just does not have the stats to be able to compete at the highest level. I think they're pretty lucky to be able to pick up a win with him as your R5 on that side, but outside of that, I think everything else is pretty in line. Ashe is really nice setup for the rest of this team, and they did get that early game lead that they were able to push out further, so credit to them. And then for K-Corp on the other side, you know, again, I like their draft more. I think that they have more options as this game continues to go along, mostly because I think Jhin Pyke is actually a really scary 2v2 to have to play into if you are CFO. I actually think that could be in favor of K-Corp if you really wanted to like nail that down, because Jhin is obviously really good into Ashe, and Pyke is always going to have more priority than someone like Thresh in the early game, just purely based off of how easy it is to kill Thresh in the current meta. The problem for that is they just didn't have a jungler this game that could actually survive. Yike is going to get dead of the game. He can't play Vi. Like, I don't know what to tell you. It's like, it's not, maybe not Peanut Zyra levels, but it's pretty darn close where he just cannot play this champion. Impact Jax, Yike Vi, Peanut Zyra. There have been so many picks across this tournament where it's just like, you gotta start picking other champions, man. You gotta start moving in different directions, and this is definitely the one for K-Corp, where it feels like every single time they pick it, even when it's in a good spot to actually succeed, Yike just doesn't really play it well. Either that, or once again, something that I talked about earlier on at this tournament, maybe they saw something on tape, or all of these teams ended up seeing something on tape, where it's like, oh, he, you know, cues over the wall very aggressively in this instance, and we can death push him in all of these specific spots, because he does keep getting caught out in a lot of those similar instances, and I just think that there's gotta be something that that they see where it's like he's going to queue over the wall here and we can just kill him, you know, over and over again. And if that's the case for Yike, he's got to completely change his pathing patterns or else he's going to continue to get taken advantage of like this, even domestically moving forward. But Yike was pretty awful here. Kana was not great on the top side on this Mbessa. Once again, the Mbessa's in a kind of rough spot here, but he needed to do a lot more. Kalista and Targamas definitely needed to be kind of a priority spot for K-Corp, and they just kind of weren't. Targamas was okay on the Pyke. Kalista, I think, was definitely way too passive on the Jhin, considering the fact that, once again, I think this 2v2 is where you have to put your priority if you're K-Corp, especially in the mid game. Vladi was fine, not really complaining about the Hui too much, but Yike cannot play Vi, and that's why they dropped this game number 3, but they still are up 2-1 in this series. If they take game number 4, game 3 will be looked at as more of an outlier than as a breath of hope for CFO. But if CFO can take game number 4, if they can tie up this series at 2 apiece, now all of a sudden they've won 2 in a row, and you're going to a Silver Scrapes do or die game number 5, and you've lost all the momentum if you're K-Corp. So I'm not going to say it's a must-win for them. It certainly is, obviously, for CFO, but it's a big game number 4. Who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 4 was CFO. They are going to take game number 4. They are going to tie this series up at 2 apiece, and we are going to a Silver Scrapes game number 5. The reverse sweep is very much in play here for CFO. K-Corp has to be sweating as of right now, because not only is it concerning that obviously you've dropped games 3 and 4, not only is it concerning that CFO played so well in game number 4 here in particular, but this was easily the most cohesive and best draft that CFO have had throughout the entirety of the series up until this point. It is very clear what they want to play for. They saw the Caitlyn get locked in on R1, and they said, we know exactly what you are going to struggle with, which is fighting in the mid game over a lot of these resources, and we are going to draft Nocturne, we are going to draft Akali, we are going to draft Renata to try and really make that as difficult as possible for you to deal with. The Caitlyn pick, quite frankly, just punished incredibly hard here. I think Wukong Aurora can be a fine mid-jungle duo, but Nocturne Akali was definitely better in this game, and, you know, add that on to the fact that the execution was really good from the 2 assassin players in this one, and you just feel really good about CFO. Again, I think this is their best draft, so let's go ahead and jump into why. Again, I think there is one kind of standout point for both teams in this game, and it's the mid game, where CFO is significantly better than K-Corp. I think in the early game, you can look at a couple of different laning phases and say, you know, I could favor one team or another. I don't think either team is going to be able to make all that many waves in the early game. You know, Kalista versus Caitlyn, 2 early game champions. Kalista kind of gets shut down a bit by Caitlyn. That's why they wanted to go for it, because her range just makes it difficult for Kalista to be able to punish. I think Karma does a good job of shutting down Renata, but it's not like Kalista Renata is going to be useless in that laning phase, and then you've basically got 2 tanks on the top side, and so you're not really looking at an early game that's going to be super active for either of these teams, and I think both of them can win team fights the later this game goes. Obviously, you have a bit more tools on the side of K-Corp. You've got things like the Wukong in order to, you know, set up a bit more consistently than maybe, I guess, like an Ornn ult plus a Renata ultimate, because that's kind of your setup. If you're CFO, you are much better looking at, like, picks and just generally just trying to get as much gold as possible in the mid game to try and get this comp later on in the game. K-Corp have much more consistent versions of engage, we'll just say, on their side. Like the Gnar, the Wukong, it just makes it so much easier. Even the Aurora flank, like, it just makes it so much easier for them to be able to fight the later this game goes, even if I don't think CFO's champions necessarily have, like, too little damage or too difficult to time front to backing. I think especially if you have someone like Kalista with a lot of gold in the back half of this game, like, Ornn's great frontline, and you do have setup here with Ornn ult and Renata ultimate, and so it wouldn't be impossible, but really at the end of the day, like, the mid-game difference between these 2 comps is absolutely ridiculous, and that's where CFO completely took advantage of this game. Hongq was going to get player of the game on the Akali. This was a brilliant Akali game, like a truly exceptionally good one. Hongq's mechanics are actually insane. This kid is just so talented, and I'm really interested to see what his career path ends up looking like. Obviously, I don't want to talk too much about, like, the future, because we're in the middle of a series that matters a ton for both of these teams and their reputations moving forward. Making the finals of an international tournament for either of these regions is absolutely ginormous, but, like, how can you not talk about Hongq's upside when watching a game like this? The kid is 17 years old. He's already performed really well at this tournament. The only times he's been taken advantage of in a really big way are either against Zeka, who's just a ridiculously good player, or in this series when he's actively counterpicking himself in the middle of draft. When he's in matchups that he actually can play out, that can be in good spots, even though this isn't like a dominant matchup. I think it's a good matchup for Akali. You're certainly winning this in the mid lane, and, you know, in matchups like that, he's able to actually take advantage of it and be really useful, especially when it comes to a lot of these skirmishes. he has shown that he can play late game carries, that he can play, strong in lane, even if the champions themselves don't necessarily indicate that play style. And now he's shown he can play assassins that really want to take over in terms of just picking up kills in the mid game. It's really, really cool. He is like dominating at this tournament. He's certainly been a lot better than I was anticipating, and I'm really excited to see what he turns into. Junjie was also a big part of this game on the Nocturne. Kaiwing was really good on the Renata. He is definitely a player I want to shout out. I feel like I've not given enough credit to Kaiwing, not only in this series, but across this entire tournament. I've really hyped up Doggo. I've really hyped up Junjie. I've really hyped up Hongq, even Rest to an extent. Like, I haven't really talked all that much about Kaiwing, but I think he has been such an integral part of why this team is good. His 2v2 skills are really, really good. Like, he is very good at playing around the 2v2. It's not just Doggo that's able to get those leads down in the bot lane. Kaiwing is a big part of that, and I think he's a lot more consistent as a late game team fighter than people give him credit for. Like, I have been impressed with Kaiwing. Outside of the Thresh pick in game number 3, I really have no complaints about him at this tournament, and like I said, Driver was solid on the Ornn. He's kind of been put on tank duty, like the Scion Ornn duty throughout this entire tournament, but this is a really straightforward draft. It's a really straightforward type of execution around Nocturne Akali, and they ended up just having more priority and using that to actively get a lot of their leads, which is exactly what you want to see. And then for K-Corp on the other side of this matchup, this is the problem of drafting Caitlyn, is you don't really have any way to skirmish over objectives in the mid game, and you kind of invested a lot into trying to team fight later on as well with Wukong and Gnar and a lot of these champs that aren't going to be as useful as you continue along in the game. Karma, not really a champion that's going to be like useful throughout the entirety of the game. It's very split in terms of the draft for K-Corp. I think the only positive is that theoretically you're shutting down the Kalista Renata on the other side of this, because Caitlyn Karma should just have more prio in the 2v2, but once again, Caitlyn's inability to fight in the mid game might even be more of a negative than it is worth like the positive of winning lane against the Kalista in this game. There were a lot of things that ended up going wrong though. Yike is once again going to get dead of the game. Yikes is back. Like, the last 2 games have just not looked good for him. Junjie has completely outjungled him in both of them, specifically of course on the Nidalee in game number 3, because that Vi was horrible, but this Wukong game wasn't better. Like, you have to try and interrupt what Nocturne and Akali want to do. You have to at the very least try to be able to match and get vision on these champions, and it just felt like Yike gave up in the mid game, didn't really have enough sense of urgency, we'll just say, in this. And I think that sometimes Yike can really struggle with that. He can really struggle to be a player that keeps his foot on the gas, especially when he has to play from behind, and I think we once again saw that here. Vladdy was completely outplayed in the mid lane here by Hongq. Not a surprise. Hongq has just been better at this tournament. Kana was not nearly good enough on the top side on this Gnar. Kalista and Targamas were in a lane that they should have won harder than they actually did, and if the Caitlyn had gold, maybe this is a different story, but that didn't end up happening. Overall, I just don't think the draft for K-Corp put them in all that good of a spot. Again, maybe you get to the late game, maybe you can play around Wukong Gnar engages and hope that Aurora Caitlyn is going to be strong enough for you to be able to win these front-to-back team fights, but I think that's such a long shot. I think this was kind of short-sighted drafting, just drafting to counter the individual lanes, and it ended up really not paying off because CFO had a much more cohesive comp just in general. But now we're going to game number 5. It's do or die. It's winner take all. The winner of this game moves on to the finals of an international tournament to represent their region, and the loser is out, and both of these teams definitely want to make the finals. Only one will be able to do it. Who will it be? Will CFO be able to complete the reverse sweep, or will K-Corp be able to get that momentum back and shut the door on it? Well, the winner of game number 5 was K-Corp. They are going to take game number 5. They are going to take this series 3-2, and they will be moving on to the finals of the 2025 First Stand tournament. Absolutely unreal. The fact that this team is heading to the finals after being 0-2 to start this tournament, after looking as bad as they looked in those 2 series, after basically being eliminated going into day number 5, needing a miracle upset of probably the most unexpected region at this tournament to do well in the LCP, taking on one of the most prestigious regions at this tournament in the LPL. They needed that upset in order to stay alive, and all of those things transpire so that they get not only into the bracket stage, but a matchup against someone that isn't Hanwha Life Esports. They get CFO in round number 1, and despite their best efforts in games 3 and 4, and even really with this draft in game number 5, they're able to come out on top. For CFO, it's, a heartbreaking outcome. I think you were so close, 1 game away from being at the finals of an international tournament, representing the LCP in their first real international tournament as this big conglomerate after the regions all kind of combined. It was an incredible tournament. Like, you can't take anything away from this team. This was truly truly an exceptional performance. Without a doubt, they were at worst a top 3 team at this tournament, regardless of whether or not you want to put them above or below K-Corp in terms of total overall success. I guess obviously the finals will indicate more on that, but they lost this series. They were better than Top Esports. They were better than Team Liquid. They were better than these teams, and I think even if you're walking out of this with kind of a sour taste in your mouth because they weren't able to make the finals as the number 2 seed, like, it's just really hard to be upset with them really in any way, because I do think they drafted well here in game number 5. I think the issue that they had is they kept Driver in. I think if you put Rest in this game, you probably end up winning it, and I hate to say that, but that really is just kind of the difference between CFO moving on to the finals and not, and we'll talk about that as we go along. But again, let's talk about the draft just in general. The reason I think CFO has such a better draft here is because I think both of these teams are opting into intense scaling as this game goes along. You don't need me to tell you that. This is Jax, Maokai, Corki, Senna coming in from the side of K-Corp, even Neela to a lesser extent, and then it's Gangplank, Orianna, like Zeri, Yumi from CFO. Both of these teams just want to get to 35 minutes as quickly as possible. Neither of them are really going to be able to control a lot in the early game. They're not going to be worried about that all that much. That being said, CFO has every winning lane. Like, yeah, maybe Neela Senna is going to have some priority down in the bot lane, but Gangplank is a fantastic R3 as an answer to Jax. You know I hate Corki early on. I think Orianna is a really nice counter to that. Skarner is going to have way more pressure and priority in the jungle than Maokai will throughout a majority of this early game. And I think CFO scale harder because I think Zeri Yumi is just like unstoppable. And then you add Orianna Ball on top of that. You know, Shockwave is obviously huge, the damage, but even the shielding that can really kind of enable a hyper carry. You add a Gangplank on top of that. Like, I think CFO have the early game advantage and the late game advantage. I don't think there's any part of the game where K-Corp should have really any sort of priority with this draft here. I think they threw it away in draft, and yet they still were able to walk out with a win because their players were just individually better. There are two that you really want to point out in this game as being exceptionally good. The main one and the obvious one to me, player of the game and player of the series as a whole, is going to go to Kana in the top lane. Kana has been ridiculous, not only at this tournament, but domestically in the LEC as well. 2025 has been an unreal good year for Kana so far. Like, he is actively making a case to be like a top 5-ish top laner in the world right now, playing in Europe, and this just kind of furthered that case. He was down like 2,000 gold going into the Gangplank, as you can expect, by the way, in this matchup. There's basically no way for Jax to actually be able to trade with Gangplank early as long as the Gangplank player is even a little bit competent, and obviously the further behind you fall into Gangplank, the worse it ends up getting because of his passive. And so you're in this situation where Kana's down like 2k gold. He should never be allowed to be able to play this game at any point, and yet by the end of the game, once we hit 39 minutes, he's been by far the most impactful player in the game. He's done significantly more than Driver on the other side of this matchup, and he actively has carried K-Corp to a victory. It's unreal stuff. He is actively just playing so much better than anybody else at this tournament. Again, like, Zeus has been unreal. If Zeus hadn't been as good as he has been at this tournament so far, Kana would be the clear-cut #1 top laner at first stand. But the problem is Zeus really has been that good, and so Kana unfortunately takes that #2 spot, but he has very much corralled that #2 spot. He has very clearly been the #2 top laner, and he is player of the series here. And then there's Yike on the Maokai. You know, take him off of these more aggressive champions that need to actually try and play the game. Let him play Maokai. Let him play Sejuani. Let him play these facilitators. This is what was working for G2 at the end of their run last year, was getting Yike on these champs, and clearly, at least in the current meta with how things have gone, it's something that Yike is just going to perform better on. At the end of the day, if that's what's going to be the case, then draft that for him. I'm not going to be too frustrated with that. Targamas had a really good game on Senna. Even if I don't love Senna, it's fearless. Like, the later you go into these drafts, the harder it is to end up getting supports that end up, you know, being impactful, especially with things like Lulu and Poppy banned throughout the back half of this. So Senna's not the worst thing in the world, but Targamas ended up playing it really well. Kaliste and Vladi were fine. Vladi got player of the series on broadcast. What? Like, that's crazy to me. Like, respectfully to Vladi, like, it wasn't even in the conversation in my eyes. Like, he probably would have been my 4th choice on K-Corp. Like, I probably would have given it to Kana, and then maybe to Yike because he was so good in their wins, even if he was bad in their losses, and then maybe to Targamas. Like, I don't really get it. Like, let me know down in the comments if I'm just underrating what Vladi was able to do, but Hongq was really good in this series, and I'm just shocked that he got it. Shout out Vladi. You know, the Corki, I guess, ends up paying off. Kaliste was solid in the bot lane as well, even if Neela is not really a game breaker or anything like that. But K-Corp, for the most part, was completely centered around Kana this series, and definitely centered around Yike in their wins. And I think that's the most encouraging sign. Kana playing like a world-class player, and K-Corp being able to make the finals after looking like they were doomed just yesterday at this tournament. And then for CFO on the other side, like, really this all comes down to, I hate boiling it down so simply, but like, it all comes down to, I think if Rest was playing in the top lane and had this same matchup, I think you would have won this game, and I think you would have won this series. And that feels really tough to say, but Driver has just been awful at this tournament. To play him in this game number 5, even if he is the better Gangplank player or the better player at, getting counterpick and taking advantage of those matchups, like whatever the reason, like Driver being in this game, I think was actually disastrous for CFO because he had the biggest lead in the entire universe, like a 2k gold lead on Gangplank, a champion that scales incredibly well and continuously gets more gold throughout the game, and he threw it away. He was easily the worst performing player in this game. It's unacceptable. He solo lost them this game. There is no reason that with this draft and with this game state, they should have ever been in a position to lose this game, and Driver, like, solo lost it. If they had played Rest here, who has been better at this tournament, I do think they just win this game, and that's a really, really sad thought to have. I want to give a lot of credit to players like Doggo and Kaiwing, who I think tried to take over on the Zeri Yumi in the back half. I don't even think Junji and Honkyu really played all that bad. I think this Gangplank actively was the biggest detriment in the entire game. Really did drag down what CFO was able to do, and at the end of the day, that's enough to be able to not get you over the finish line in a scaling game that goes 40 minutes, and so it's an unfortunate turn of events, but again, I don't want to, like, rag on CFO. This was such an incredible tournament for them. They played so well throughout all of this. They end up going to 5 games against, an LEC team, the LEC champions in K-Corp. They end up being 3-1 in the group stage. Like, there is nothing but positive vibes to take away from this, and honestly, I feel so much better about the LCP as a region right now than I have at any point really in the past 3 or so years. It's ridiculous how well they ended up performing, and they just couldn't quite get it done here in the semis. But congratulations to K-Corp, a team that looked like they were in the dirt, like they would be the first team eliminated from this tournament just yesterday, is now walking out and going to finals to take on the winner of the series we'll talk about next. They'll obviously be pretty big underdogs depending on who ends up going to the finals. If the expected result happens, they will be pretty big underdogs in that series, but they've leveled up every single game throughout this tournament. Who's to say they can't continue to do that now? But then moving on now to our second series of the semifinals, and this is a massive matchup for the semifinals. It was the 2 tournament favorites going into this tournament that have obviously gone in different directions. It's the representative from the LCK and the number 1 seed in Hanwha Life Esports taking on the number 4 seed and representative from the LPL in Top Esports. This is a very interesting matchup because, again, going into this tournament, we would have expected that this was the clear-cut finals. Basically, no matter what ended up happening, these were clearly the 2 best teams at the tournament, but because Top Esports has been so underwhelming and because HLE has been so unbelievably dominant so far at this tournament, they end up playing off against each other in round number 1 here, or I guess in the semifinals, whatever you want to call it. One of these teams is guaranteed to not be making the finals, and you know what? There's a pretty darn big favorite when it comes to this series. Not only was there already a team that looked like they were the best team in the world coming into this tournament, but they have done nothing but solidify that on home soil, that of course being Hanwha Life Esports here as the number 1 seed. They have been unreal at this tournament. They've dropped games here or there. They dropped a game to K-Corp. They dropped a game to Team Liquid, but they've been doing that because they're trolling drafts as hard as humanly possible. They're drafting things like Vladimir super regularly. In fact, Vladimir is the only champion that Zeus has played more than once at this tournament. They're drafting Cassidym. They're drafting Kale and Quinn and other stuff like that on the top side. Like, they are just going absolutely bananas in terms of the solo laners that they're putting together, and they're not necessarily putting good comps around them to try to enable these champions. They're just better than all of the people that they're playing into. They can get away with playing basically anything that they want, and that's the only reason they've dropped any games at this tournament. Every single time it feels like they've actually tried to play the game, it's not been remotely close. They obliterated Top Esports on day number 1 of this tournament. They obliterated CFO on day number 2 of this tournament, and CFO's a good team. Top Esports, we expected to be a good team. Every single time HLE has taken any of these series even a little bit seriously, they've just absolutely decimated their opponent, which leads me to believe that this is not going to be a particularly close matchup. However, this is still the LPL champion coming in as Top Esports. Like, I get that they've underperformed so far at this tournament, and a lot of the things that they've underperformed on, I don't expect them to get a ton better at. I think that there's been an inherent lack of energy and just like general like meta knowledge from this team. It doesn't really feel like they were super prepared for this tournament, kind of in a similar way to what K-Corp was going through at the beginning of this tournament, where it felt like because their regular season ended so late, they didn't have as much time to prep specifically for the teams here, or I guess nearly as much time as the other teams at this tournament, and so they kind of were on the back foot when it came to that. But there are like inherent problems. Kanavi has been awful at this tournament coming out of the jungle, and he's going into Peanut, who has been really exceptional, especially when playing champions like Nidalee that can really control the pace of the game. Of course, Peanut is the best like Maokai Sejuani player in the world. He has been for a very long time, and so it's very difficult to imagine a world where Kanavi's going to have a ton of pressure in the middle of the map there. Cream has not been very good at this tournament. Zeka has been exceptionally good, maybe the single best player at the entire tournament going into this. 369 has not really had that great of a tournament. Zeus has been the only player that I think is contesting Zeka for being the best player at this tournament. Like Viper and Delight have been super consistent as a bot lane, which was their only concern coming into this tournament, is their good games would look good and their bad games would look bad. Well, they haven't had any bad games over the course of this, and Jackie Love and Crisp certainly have. Jackie Love has not done anything at this tournament, so on paper, this doesn't feel particularly good for Top Esports. You're very concerned about this matchup, but if you can get any semblance of that form that they had domestically, where they were able to really run the gauntlet, like, I want to make it clear, Top Esports obviously has this reputation of being international chokers, and the funny part of that is it doesn't matter who's on the team. Kanavi and Cream and 369 and Jackie Love, like, Top Esports has been chokers long before any of these players existed. It feels like an organizational curse rather than any of the players individually being considered like international chokers, at least in my opinion. That's just kind of the way that I've viewed it. But like, you have to remember, this team kind of really was the best team in the LPL. Like, I get it that they weren't first in their group. In the group stage, they ended up losing to AL in their group. They did not win Demacia Cup. They lost to AL and Demacia Cup, but because of that, they had only lost to one team throughout the entirety of, like, the quote-unquote, like, preseason and regular season, and then going into the playoffs, because of that, they were on the lower side of the bracket, and they ran that. They beat Invictus Gaming. They beat Ninjas in Pajamas. They beat Billy Gaming, the back-to-back champions of the LPL. They beat JD Gaming with their revamped, like, Scout Pays roster, and they beat AL in the finals, the team that they had struggled to overcome. This is not a team that was like undeserving of being the representative from the LPL. They absolutely deserved to win it in terms of how their playoffs ended up going and even how their regular season ended up going, and yet it just isn't able to show up here. I think if they're able to get a little bit of that magic back, like going into this tournament, I really didn't think these two teams were all that separate in terms of skill level. I thought HLE was definitely better, and they were definitely number one in my power rankings because of that, but Top Esports wasn't a team that I thought was going to get like absolutely obliterated by HLE. If they can get that version, like, a miracle is possible for them. They just need to do it now. Obviously, there's no more chances after this. So the expectation for me is HLE. I believe I said HLE 3-1, but I said it was closer to 3-0 than 3-2, and I still believe that. If HLE drop more than a game this series, I think they're going to look at this as a bit of a disappointment because Top Esports is just not playing well at this tournament. They need to show up here, though. So we'll see if they can do that here in game number 1. This would be a pretty fantastic game for them to win. We'll see if they can get it done, because the winner of game number 1 was Hanwha Life Esports. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up 1-0 in this series, and I think the concerning thing is that this looked like the actual group stage version of both of these teams, and that's not good for Top Esports. They got completely outplayed here. They really had no pressure and no semblance of, like, cohesion throughout the entirety of this game. I think their draft is honestly kind of fine. Like, this is, again, kind of the traditional game 1 trade that we've seen throughout a lot of this tournament, where blue side ends up picking Rumble and Azir and, you know, playing for team fights, and Top Esports ends up, or I guess not Top Esports, red side ends up picking Sejuani and Yone to end up countering that. Jace is often left up, and then whatever early game bot lane you can throw down in the 2v2 that you feel comfortable playing. That's generally been kind of the way that things have gone throughout this tournament, and that was definitely no different here. But I think for the first time in a while, it's actually the late game team comp that does end up coming out on top, mostly because they won early anyways, because they're just better players, and the bot lane was absolutely ridiculous in this game. Viper and Delight played out of their minds in game number 1, which we will obviously talk about, but Top Esports just have no idea how to control a game right now. Their macro is atrocious, like truly awful. I don't even really know how to talk about it. It feels like they are just completely lost in terms of how to play out a lot of the early game here, and that is just unacceptable from the representative from the LPL. Like, they were doing this totally fine domestically. Whatever happened coming to Korea and just internationally, like whatever mental block that they end up having, like it has completely destroyed their ability to play out the early game. And I think that that, again, is the most detrimental thing towards their team, because if you draft a comp like this, you have to be able to win early. And if your Yone is getting absolutely clobbered, that's not good. I will say, I do think that this is a tougher game for Yone than the other like Yone into Azir matchups, because I do think Ezreal is going to be fine on the bot side, and Wukong does offer a bit more like intrigue coming out of the jungle than someone like Xin Zhao would in that spot, at least in terms of specifically taking advantage of Yone. But even that being said, like this is still a Yone favored matchup, and you know, Cream wasn't very good. This is still like a Wukong Rumble on the top side who just want to play for late game going into a Jace and a Misfortune on the other side. Like there is no excuse for blue side being able to win all of these fights in the mid game. There just really isn't. It should not be happening, and yet it was. Player of the game for me, kind of up in the air. I think think it's got to go to one of the two bot lane members because they were truly exceptionally good here in game number 1. I'm giving it to Delight. I continue to be super impressed with Delight so far in 2025. I mean it when I say that, like, every single time I see Delight play a game of League of Legends, or especially like a big game of League of Legends, you know, a playoff series or, you know, a big international series like this, he just gets better and better every single time I watch him. That, like, trajectory, that upwards curve that he's been on in terms of, like, the pathway in the LCK, it's just continued to go up. It didn't stop on Gen G. It didn't stop when he left Gen G and went to HLE and won the LCK last year, and it's not stopping right now. He continues to get better. He is the best support in the world at the current moment, and honestly, I'm just super impressed to be able to say that. He completely gapped Jackie Love and Crisp on the other side of this matchup. And Crisp, I think, actually played well on the Rakan. It's just only so much you can do on an R5 Rakan in this game in particular. Viper was really good at being able to follow up. He has been very good at this tournament. I was critical of his domestic play because he was a lot more inconsistent than maybe he was allowed to be in terms of how this team operated, losing a lot of games for this team in terms of their playoff run. But him and Delight have been unreal at this tournament so far. Peanut was really good on the Wukong. This has always been one of his better champions. You know, Zeus was fine on the Rumble. They put a lot of resources and effort into trying to take the Rumble down, but it ended up leaving a lot more opportunities for Zeka to be really good on his Azir, which is one of his best champions as well. So overall, just like a really nice game from HLE, controlling the entire pacing, understanding that they're always going to win in the late game. So if they get these mid-game advantages, it's basically over, and, you know, getting a sub-30 win here in game number 1. And for Top Esports, it just kind of looks a little bit doomed at the current moment, not because, like, losing game 1 is just like a disaster and you can't come back from that. We saw a potential reverse sweep, like a close to reverse sweep in the first series here today, but mostly because of the way that they're losing, which is the inability to play through any of their laners really at any point. Cream got decimated in the mid lane. He's gonna get dead of the game. He's had a bad tournament. Like, he was looking good in the first couple of days. I thought he looked okay against HLE the first time these two teams played, and then he was obviously very good against Team Liquid. But the problem with Cream is that when he loses very hard. He can be a bit of a feast or famine player in that regard. He just was losing a lot less and was certainly a lot more versatile in terms of his skill set. The problem is when he goes up against a player like Zeka, who's kind of just a better version of Cream, like, it's really difficult for me to imagine a world where he's ever going to have priority there. Jackie Love continues to really struggle at this tournament. People will blame it on misfortune, but we've seen MF be super valuable in certain comps at this tournament, and Jackie Love just continues to pilot it pretty poorly. Crisp was really good in this game on the Rakan, and it does not matter. 369 was fine on the Jace, but received a lot of resources. Kanavi was trying his best to not lose the game as hard as he possibly could, but it's not like he was winning the jungle matchup. Overall for TES, you're still just getting outpaced. You're still just behind the 8 ball in terms of how things are going, and now you're down 0-1 to a team that already was, like, big favorites in this series. If you don't win game 2, like, it's a wrap. Like, I don't think you're winning 3 games in a row against Hanwha Life unless something goes absolutely terribly wrong. So this is a must-win game for Top Esports here in game 2, and if HLE can pick it up, we might be looking at a pretty quick series here. So is that going to be the case? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Hanwha Life Esports. Yeah, it's doomed for Top Esports. There is no way to come back from this. Not only are they now down 0-2 in this series, you know, HLE taking the 2-0 lead by picking up game 2, but if you can't win this game, if you're getting obliterated in the way that you lost this game, it's doomed. Like, there is no hope. There is no way that you are going to be able to win a game in this series if this is giving you trouble. This is like a pure ego game from HLE, not even in all the ways that you think. They see, I think specifically, like, the one that is going to get pointed out a lot, they see the Silas for Cream, and they're like, yeah, we're picking a Kali. We're the same player. We both like to play these melee assassins. These are both of our 2 best champions. We know this matchup inside and out. I'm going to pick it, and I'm going to go 14-2-14 on a Kali into you. Good luck, man. Like, you know, nice try. But even outside of that, like, Top Esports has every bit of priority in this game. Varus is going to have more than Ashe in the early game. You know, Nautilus kind of helps into that. Silas into a Kali, I think, is relatively neutral, but Xin Zhao just has way more priority than, like, Vi in that matchup in the early game, where Nectin obviously is going to have some early advantages into Aatrox. Like, you're looking at a matchup where all 3 lanes are, for the most part, just straight up winning on the side of Top Esports. Most of it because of Kanavi on this Xin Zhao. Like, you should never not have priority throughout this game, and yet Hanwha Life not only obliterate the early game, not only obliterate the mid game where they're supposed to be weaker, but do it in such ridiculously dominant fashion that it honestly doesn't even feel like 2 professional teams going into each other. I know that the game wasn't that bad. There were things that, you know, Top Esports did that were okay. They had Void Grub priority this game. They were able to pick up a few kills here or there. Like, they weren't completely trounced in the same way that you would see from like a 35-0 type of game. But dude, Peanut went 16-1-16 in this game. Zeka went 14-2-14 in this game. Delight had 31 assists, and this is like the #1 team from the LPL. It's doomed, bro. Like, it's actually just over. Peanut's gonna get player of the game. Like, what do you want me to say? Could go to Peanut or Zeka. Should go to one of those two. Absolutely unreal and ridiculous output from the mid-jungle duo here of Hanwha Life Esports. If they perform like this throughout the rest of the day or throughout this game number 3, like, it's unwinnable. It's actually just unwinnable. Once again, I don't even think they have priority in the early game here. The Vi Akali should not be out-pressuring Xinjiao Silas in the early game. It just should not be happening, and yet Peanut and Zeka have some of the most ridiculous scorelines that you will ever see in a pro game. You have Viper and Delight, once again, just kind of winning on the bot side in a matchup that isn't even really all that favored for them. You have Zeus kind of being neutral on the top side, but definitely being better than 369 as the game continues to go along. 369 was honestly fine on the other side of this matchup. Probably the best performing player for Top Esports in this game, but like, what do you even do if you're TES? What is HLE supposed to do that's more than this? This is a perfect game from HLE. It's giving them all the priority in the world and still absolutely slaughtering them. Utterly ridiculous. And for Top Esports, like, again, what do you do? What are you supposed to do when you are so thoroughly outclassed and out-executed in a game like this where you should be able to at least do something? Like, to look back on this and be like, we kind of got trounced, like, it's just completely unacceptable. There is no way to be able to write off this game number 2 as anything other than a massive disappointment. Jackie Love is going to get my dud of the game here, although Crisp deserves it, Cream definitely deserves it, Kanavi definitely deserves it. Like, the entire team, really, with the exception of 369, is getting dud of the game here for game number 2 because all of them were just outplayed, but Jackie Love in particular is really starting to get under my skin because he's just playing so much worse than he played domestically, and really he's playing so much worse than he's played at any point in the past couple of years, including at these international tournaments that Top Esports has already not performed the way that they wanted at. Like, Jackie Love has been good at those tournaments. He was really good at Worlds last year, and it just doesn't end up mattering. We have to remember, like, I get that TES has the reputation of being bad international performers, and, you know, that does carry through with the fact that they've not really been able to finish, like, top 4 in any of these major, like, Worlds tournaments, or, you know, obviously they're underperforming here, but they were really good at Worlds in terms of the Swiss stage. They just ran into T1 in the quarterfinals, which was obviously a bit of a disappointment, but like, Jackie Love has performed well internationally before. It's just not meant to be right now. The dude is playing the worst league I've seen him play in many years. Cream is getting completely outplayed by a player who's just better than him in every aspect. He's literally him, but better. Like, Kanavi is not here at this tournament. The guy has not shown up. Crisp is trying his best to be super aggressive, but for the most part, it's just getting punished. And what's 369 going to do as Renekton on the top side of this? It's actually just doomed. Now, maybe they pull out a game number 3. Maybe HLE end up trolling this draft phase and drafting, I don't know, Teemo or something in the top lane, something ridiculous, right, for Zeus. But at the end of the day, Top Esports look completely cooked. If HLE are going to take these games seriously, I just don't really see a world in which they end up dropping more than a game in this series. So I guess the only way to know if this is going to be a sweep is to go into game 3. Is Top Esports going to be able to stay alive for one more, or is HLE going to thoroughly obliterate the LPL at this tournament? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Hanwha Life Esports. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to clean sweep this series 3-0 to make their way into the finals against Corp. And oh my god, this series was just not close. Like, I don't know what you want me to say. I honestly probably won't even spend all that much time on game number 3 because I've gone over all of it already in games 1 and 2. Like, Top Esports got obliterated. It was not close. There was no, like, way for them to get back into any of these games. This was definitely the sloppiest of all of the games, but I also think this is a very weird draft from HLE where they're, again, just kind of giving over pressure in the mid game. You have no way to skirmish at all into, like, Pantheon or Aurora or anything like that, but on top of that, Top Esports is also kind of countering themselves by picking Pantheon into something like Maokai, where he's never going to have any priority in the back half of this game. Pantheon's basically going to get shut down as this game continues to go further and further along, and that's where HLE can really start to get their advantages, but it's just a ridiculous game. Like, as much as I would love to sit here and talk about the draft and talk about the intricacies of, like, why each pick ended up mattering, I honestly think HLE was just picking the first thing that ended up coming to their mind. I think the most interesting thing from draft is that they are able to flex the Vladimir into the mid lane. Like, that's something that Corp has to be aware of now because so far Zeus has been the only one to play it on the team. The fact that Zeka picked it up here and looked totally fine on the Vlad playing into the Aurora, I think is one of those signs that, like, okay, well, it is a flex pick for them. It always is a flex pick, but it definitely is for HLE, at least in terms of practice as well. The Jhin ends up getting super fed in this game. Viper's going to get player of the game for me on the Jhin. He was awesome throughout this series. The bot lane in general was really awesome, and I definitely considered Viper for player of the series. I didn't end up giving it to him, but this Jhin game was great. Jhin has been a very productive AD carry at this tournament in the right matchups. I think the later you go into Fearless, the higher priority something like Jhin is going to be. He also has decently good matchups into a lot of the meta AD carries, like Ashe is obviously the one that comes to mind, but he does pretty well into a lot of the ADCs that are just kind of generally strong right now. Corki is another one on the other side of this matchup, but, you know, we've seen multiple games where Jhin is able to completely pop off and kind of dominate. This was just another one in favor of Viper. But player of the series to me, it was kind of back and forth. There were two players I definitely considered for it. I'm giving it to Delight in the support position. I felt like he was the most consistent. He was really good in game number 1 on the Alistair, and he played an awesome Blitzcrank game here in game number 3, and that's what really sealed it for me was the Blitz game. Peanut was the other player that obviously I considered. He had a fantastic series coming out of the jungle. I've given Peanut a lot of credit at this tournament. I wanted to give Delight some as well. I think if you wanted to give it to Peanut, it's up to you. I'm giving it to Delight. I think he was the most impactful player in this series, and honestly, the bot lane in general just was so much better than Jackie Love and Crisp on the other side, and that's with Crisp easily being the best player on top esports in this series. Like, Viper and Delight were just so head and shoulders above them that it was actually ridiculous. Blitzcrank Jhin ended up being basically undealable with for top esports. You know, obviously Peanut was awesome. He ends up playing Maokai at a super high level. He's the best Maokai player in the world, and it's not particularly close. I think Tarzan might be the only player that can even come into conversation for that, but I think Tarzan is better at champions like Sejuani, and I think Peanut is better at champions like Maokai, and so credit to Peanut, continues to play really well, especially on the champs that he's known for. The Vlad in the mid lane, the flex into the mid lane worked out really well, kind of shut down the Aurora, although Cream definitely probably had his best game of the entire series here. Zeka still was way more relevant on the Vlad because you can't really take advantage of that champion in any conceivable way. Zeus was whatever on the top side. I'm pretty out on Jax as a champion. I think his win condition is too specific, and I think he's also way too exploitable in most matchups, but, you know, whatever. Zeus was still fine. He's been such a star throughout the rest of this tournament that I'm not really going to be too hard on him for a Jax game that was just kind of meh. He still was way better than 369 on the other side, but overall, HLE was so far and away better than top esports, and that's the thing, right? Is like, I just don't think anybody at this tournament is even on the level of Hanwha Life. I don't even think there's anybody that can compete at a general level with them as long as they're taking all of these games seriously, and all this series did was really reiterate that for me. Then for TES on the other side, I mean, what do you want me to say? 0-3 out of this tournament. They went 0-5 against HLE. They went 0-2 against K-Corp. They went 0-2 against the Flying Oysters. The only team that they picked up a single game win against was Team Liquid, who was out first in this tournament. Like, there is a real argument that Top Esports was, like, the worst performing team at first stand. Maybe the second worst only outside of Team Liquid, if you really want to go down that route. It's actually just unreal how bad this team has been at this tournament. It's completely unexpected, and really, it's unprecedented. We've not seen the LPL perform like this internationally basically ever, especially when there's only one representative from the region. Like, I get that Top Esports has had bad international showings in the past. This is the worst of them. Even when you go back to like 2022, when they get knocked out in group stage, when DRX ends up making it, when they end up losing to, I want to say it's GAM. It's definitely a VCS team. When they end up losing in the group stage because of the ridiculous backdoor and the broken Zonias, like at 2022 Worlds, like even that underperformance where they don't make it out of the group stage, like that was infinitely better than this performance. This is the worst Top Esports has ever looked at an international tournament, and that's amidst all of their deficiencies, and that's just a really bad thing to say. Kanavi's going to get dead of the game here for game number 5, or game number 3. It feels like a game 5 because this series felt like it took forever with how not close it was, but like, you picked Pantheon into Maokai, you deserve to lose. Like, what do you expect to happen in this matchup? 369 was horrible on the Ambessa, even with Zeus not necessarily being all that good on the Jax himself. Jackie Love and Crisp got completely outplayed. Jackie Love in particular had a really horrendous series. Viper was better in every conceivable way. Crisp was easily the best player on Top Esports in this series, and I do think it's unfortunately gonna kind of move towards him being blamed a little bit more, if only because like Crisp already has this reputation of being a bit of an inter, and I do think people are gonna look at some of the KDAs and see Crisp in a negative way, but I think he was definitely the best player on the team in this series. And Cream, like, the scoreline wasn't nearly as good as, I mean, the scoreline's better than the gameplay, I'll say that. Like, the KDA looks okay, it looks like he was effective, and he was, like, more effective than he was in the first couple games, but he still wasn't great on the Aurora here. Like, Zeka completely outplayed him, is, again, just the better version of Cream, and now Top Esports has to go back to the LPL as, like, failures, quite frankly. Like, this is a failure. This is not just, you know, it wasn't our tournament. This is, like, they have let the LPL down, and they have to go back domestically now and see if they can recapture that form. This is still a team that might be able to perform really well domestically. We don't really know, but this tournament really soured me on what Top Esports upside looks like, and that's very disappointing. But for Hanwha Life, once again, congratulations. You're moving on to the finals. We'll preview that in just a second, but this team has absolutely deserved all of the praise that they're going to get. They are far and away the best team at this tournament, and it doesn't even really feel all that close. All right, but that is going to do it for my semifinals overview and analysis video here at First Stand. We got our final two teams. We got our two finals competitors. It's Hanwha Life Esports, the representative from the hometown LCK, and K-Corp, the representative from the LEC. Somehow, someway, K-Corp ends up making the finals of a tournament where it looked like they were doomed after the first 2 days of the tournament. They end up being able to survive just off the skin of their own teeth, and they make it here to the finals by picking up a 5-game win over CFO. I imagine this is the end of the Cinderella story. I do not think that they have the firepower to go up against HLE. It looks like they are basically unstoppable. Maybe HLE don't take them super seriously in a couple of games. Maybe they go up 2-0 and troll a Game 3 draft, and K-Corp can take a game just like they did in their best of 3 against each other in the group stage. But like, let's be real here. If we're previewing the final series, if we're talking about what we can expect, if HLE don't win this at the bare minimum 3-1, it's a massive upset and it's a massive disappointment. If this even goes to a Game 5, like, K-Corp is already in the best possible scenario that they could be in. You know, that would be best case scenario. So hopefully for K-Corp, for their sake, they can make it a lot more interesting. They have been getting better throughout the tournament, and that win over CFO is pretty massive, but HLE, again, dropping games at all is going to be an upset for HLE. So we'll see how it ends up going. My prediction is that this will be Hanwha Life 3-0. I do think that they will take the finals incredibly seriously. I think they want to, you know, bring this trophy home, and I think that they will in a 3-0 sweep. But let me know if you agree or disagree with that takedown in the comment section below. Always curious to hear your thoughts and opinions down there. Hope you enjoyed the video, though. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit subscribe. We'll be covering, of course, the finals tomorrow. We're going to be going live later today here on YouTube and on Twitch. Link to that is down in the description. Live co-streaming the NACL OQs for Citadel Gaming. It's the final weekend to see who the final team out of the lower part of the bracket will be to qualify. So if you're interested in that, then hit a follow, hit a subscribe, and obviously we'll be live later today and hopefully tomorrow as well if Citadel is still active. But after all of that, we will be posting about all of the domestic leagues once we start getting back into the spring split. So lots of content coming your way. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all